Hello and welcome to the TRILUX Academy. My name's Helen Loons.
And my name's Jamie Yates.
The subject for today is lighting large spaces, or as we like to refer it, big sheds.
With the big expansion recently over the last few years in big sheds, they are large spaces and they all have different requirements. However, there are common denominators amongst these, and that's generally that they are prefabricated, not quite off-site construction, but prefabricated lean construction methods, quick installation, and they generally have a sort of 15 to 25 year life cycle. Now, the topics that we're going to be covering today are retail, requirements vary from retailer to retailer there, logistics, and data centres. They all have some common themes, but they also have some very varying themes.
Specific requirements.
Absolutely.
So let's take a look at retail first. Lighting can take many different forms within large areas, but the normal criteria still apply. We still have to think about horizontal and vertical levels, and we need to have a reasonable level of uniformity. Lighting for retail could be cross aisle, or it could be with the aisle, which is more usual for fixed racking or very dense racking,
Yep.
or it could be a combination of both.
And when they have the combination of the both, is it normally the sort of cross aisle that goes across the ends of the aisles?
Yes, usually you'd go with the aisle and then across at the end of the row. Quite often there's also an open area where they might have central display areas and give a more larger circulation space.
So sort of large items as well,
Yeah.
that you can walk
Yeah.
around and touch and feel.
And this is also an area where you could start bringing in the 45-degree theory. It's an unusual solution, but I have seen some very good research done with the luminaires running at 45 degrees across the whole store. This means that the vertical surfaces on racking get lit very well, and also you've got the flexibility to move your racking a lot. It also looks quite good in the open air spaces as well. Vertical surfaces are important, not just on the racking, but also the perimeter of the store. Here you've got a very large area that you need to bring people's attention to.
Yeah, so you probably have signage up high,
Yeah.
so people viewing it from a long way away across the store needing to know, for example, this particular image here, that it's the cycle equipment. So you may have cycling put across at a very high level, so you might be using asymmetric lenses there.
It's very good for wayfinding, for people to have the navigation around the store.
Yeah.
And as you say, lighting up high gives the whole area a much more airy feeling. It lifts it, yes. Many stores will have daylight coming in, especially from skylights. And these skylights can provide a very high level of light. Not the sort of levels that we can normally use with artificial lighting, but they can be very useful coming in, especially as it is a free commodity. Why not make use of this commodity?
Indeed. So what you can also utilise here is daylight sensors, which is an obvious benefit, but you have to balance it with the lit environment for sort of product illumination. So you wouldn't light this space using the daylight sensors in the same way that you would an office, where you may even turn the luminaires off because you've got sufficient lighting in there. You wouldn't necessarily do that in a retail environment.
Daylight could make product look very flat.
Yes.
It's such an even illumination that you tend to lose that point of interest.
Especially if the skylights are sort of north light facing.
Yeah, so we quite often need to add accent lighting to supplement the daylight, and especially if products are very similar. It could end up looking really flat and boring. So additional accent light is always useful.
Indeed.
When lighting, we certainly have to consider the style. Interior designers will often have a big say here. So we have to consider that there might be a look that they're going for, or it might be that some areas need particular attention. If we think about a coffee area within a store, you might want to bring the ceiling down, make it more intimate, and change the style of the lighting. But all of this will be dictated to by the interior designer. Or it could even just be as a decorative element. They might want to be uplifting the standard of the store to make it look more attractive to the customer coming in there.
So spending a little bit more time there in the coffee shop environment,
Yeah.
so you're utilising it not just as a place to go and shop, but somewhere to spend a bit of time, meet friends, etc.
There is a danger with sheds that they can look very cheap and boring, and we can use lighting to add another element.
Indeed.
This technique of lowering the lighting to zone an area can be taken a stage further by actually lowering the ceiling as well.
Yep.
So we could lower ceiling, we could lower lighting, or we could use a combination of the two to really bring attention and focus to an area.
So it sort of helps to zone those specific areas like wine or a bakery or something like that.
Yeah, it could be wine, food, it could be, as we said, the cafe area, it could be a particular style of goods that they want to sell. So within a sports shop, there might be the high-end stuff that they really want to bring attention to.
Okay.
The cash register area is a really important area. This is quite often the first time the customer comes face to face with an employee of the store. So we need to think about several different requirements of the lighting in this area. We need to make it friendly, we need to make it open and airy, but of course the employees are there for long periods of time and they have a task to achieve as well.
We do.
So we have to consider both aspects of the lighting within that area.
One of the other important factors about the cash registers is the luminaires generally tend to sort of change slightly in style at the cash registers, so that across the shop you can then see fairly easily from a long distance away without any signage.
It's using the lighting
Where it is.
again
Yeah.
for wayfinding. This particular supermarket has had very special treatment, using human-centric lighting within a supermarket, which is quite a new concept. And we have actually produced a separate video on human-centric lighting in retail, which really goes into detail about the research on this project. But it's very interesting how a large space can be transformed just by using the lighting.
Yeah. Big factor with Big Shed and specifically to retail is the exterior lighting. This will be covering car park, entrance, the frontage and also the loading bays out of the back.
Yeah, you've got very different requirements there. The entrance needs to be attractive, it needs to draw people to it. Car parks, we need to make sure it's safe for everybody. And the loading bay, there's a lot of quite intricate task going on there. It could be a fairly unsafe zone, so we need to make sure it's lit properly. Car parks have very specific requirements.
They do, and that's why we've produced a different webinar on car parks.
We have yet another video detailing lighting for car parks.
So next one is logistics on our Big Shed series, and these can come in many, many different forms. You will have variation in the types of logistics sheds, whether they be owner-operators or whether they be by a developer. But ultimately you'll have high racking, low racking, open areas, cold stores, medical environments. Food will have different requirements to dry goods and other things like that.
And then we've also got main distribution centres
Yes.
and local area last mile, local distribution centres, which could have very different requirements again.
Yeah, so the last mile is generally a smaller distribution centre or a smaller shed rather than a big shed that's used for a main hub distribution, and they will tend to be serviced by vans rather than HGVs, so that'll be the key difference there.
Yeah.
So within big sheds for logistics, there are three key areas that you look at. So you'll generally have hand picking, forklift access, and maybe even automated, and you might have a combination of two or even all three within any one shed.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because historically, within warehouses, we've always considered the vertical lighting element. We've always aimed to get it as even a distribution as possible from top to bottom, which is important for your forklift driver. But if we're talking about hand picking, it's the lighting on the lower levels that are more important. And if it's automated,
you really don't need much lighting at all.
no. So our requirements for warehouses have changed quite a bit, considering on different types of warehouse applications. Of course, lighting on the floor is also very important, especially for traffic movement, whether it's a forklift driver or people.
Or both in the same space.
Or a combination of the two. We have to think about, we might need a higher level to avoid accidents. There are various recommended levels, so for an unmanned area, we really only need about 20 lux.
Yeah, the 20 lux generally is there just so that cameras and CCTV may pick it up, what's happening to the machinery, but the lighting might need to ramp up to a higher level for when visitors come and view the space, or if you've got maintenance happening as well.
Yeah.
So whilst it's a very low level, you do then need to be able to ramp it up at certain key points in time. You might also, within the same space, go up to sort of 500 lux if you've got a quality inspection or a returns area where a little bit more detail needs to be looked at, and therefore you need those higher levels of lighting.
Yes, that brings us back to our normal lighting requirements for a workspace.
Yeah.
So 500 lux very often is needed. These open areas could involve all sorts of different activities. They could be packing, they could be preparation for transportation.
Yeah.
So when we're thinking about the distribution of the luminaire, it might be completely different. We might want a broader polar curve, more even horizontal illumination.
Yeah.
So we might have to change the luminaire completely, or we might have to think about flexibility. How can we utilise these spaces for different activities, and also to allow the operator to change
Yeah, because they might grow or shrink as the sort of business changes.
Yeah.
Controls is a hugely important factor within the logistics environment for lighting, whether this be through some of the new technology of predictive maintenance and live energy monitoring and things like that. But obviously going back to the basics of daylight detection and presence detection.
Yes.
So racking areas, you'll generally have presence detection and daylight detection, but the daylight has less impact on a higher racking environment than it would on an open area.
It's very interesting to see how lighting can just come on when there's something going down a particular aisle.
Yep.
And this video shows very well how this can be utilised and therefore save a lot of energy.
Yeah, so we're going to run a little video now of DocVast, which is utilising the latest version of LiveLink Premium, which is a control system that gives you a lot more functionality than just daylight and presence. Also gives you predictive maintenance and, as we've said, live energy monitoring and various other aspects. So the next element for logistics is the transport apron and all of the externals. So a little bit like the retail element, where you'll have loading bays and you'll have car parking. The size of those areas actually has a bit of a role reversal, whereby the HGV area will be much larger compared to retail, and then the car parking will be relatively small for staff, whether that be office-based staff or picking.
These loading bays can be quite dangerous areas. You've got huge, great trucks reversing into a loading bay.
Indeed.
So, people could very easily get squashed.
Yes.
These loading bays, of course, connect to the inside of the building. So we have to think about the transitions, lighting from the inside to the outside, and of course the safety element as well.
Yeah, so these areas might have come from the open area, and they might also be temperature controlled,
Yes.
which leads us neatly onto the next piece. Cold stores or just temperature controlled areas within logistics are growing at a huge rate within the logistics environment. Whether it be for food items, which obviously need to be controlled at a particular temperature, or even through to medical supplies and equipment,
Yes.
these also need to be controlled, and in some cases also have humidity control as well. So having luminaires that can cope with the particular temperature ranges that are needed within these spaces is critically important. So they may be, something fairly normal around about 5 degrees, which is easy to deal with, but right down to sort of minus 25, maybe even minus 30, especially if the luminaires are in the higher space by the blast chillers, they will need to cope with a much lower temperature range than the actual physical ambient temperature that might be down where the product is. So cold stores, temperature controlled areas, area of growth for logistics at the moment. So the final one on our Big Sheds series is data centres.
This is the complicated one.
Yes, this is quite a complicated one, an unusual one. Whilst it is still a large structure that's built in the same methodology, from the outside looking in, there's an obvious one in that there are no loading bays or very few loading bays. The car parks will be quite small, very few, if any, windows into the space. So even from the outside, it will look completely different. So the purpose and the reason for data centres is a multitude of reasons for business operation in the 21st century. So you'll have co-location services coming out of there, cloud services, independent networking connectivity, disaster recovery, managed storage, managed security, and also high availability. So the ability to be able to utilise a data centre, very, very quickly, and almost have a whole data centre sometimes just on standby.
And our requirements are going to get even larger in the future.
Yeah, the more and more we use these things, the more and more data we need. So there is a big difference in requirements on data centres depending on whether they are an owner-operator or whether they're a leased premises. And also the size of data centres can vary enormously. So the large spaces might not have critical requirements for lighting and they're manned less often. But there's a whole different sort of language that is utilised in data centres. So we don't talk about metre squared like we do in logistics or maybe in large retail. We'll be talking in megawatts.
Yeah.
So, for example, a small local data centre, 15 megawatts, up to a hyperscale data centre of maybe 150 megawatts. Again, same as the retail and also logistics, generally these are designed with a life cycle of 15 to 25 years, 24/7 operation, but the other elements to these are high reliability, high security, redundancy backup, huge data cable connections coming into these sites as well as power supply infrastructure is a huge demand for data centres.
But on a day-to-day basis, not much requirement for lighting.
No, and that we'll dip into now. So whilst the building methods can be commonplace within data centres, there is a huge variation between the owner-operator and the multi-tenanted lease space. So by the term multi-tenanted lease space, what I mean is there will be an operator of a data centre and then maybe a company like TRILUX might rent particular space within that data centre for our own servers. So you would have multiple companies operating the space within that one building, and it's the owner of that building who is operating the data centre or giving a small footprint to the clients who are within that space.
Whereas if the client is the end user, they have much more knowledge about what their requirements are.
Exactly. So like the Amazons and the Googles and those types of people. So this is where the construction might vary. So on an owner-operator, generally the construction is phased on an on-stream timescale. This has an impact on the emergency lighting and also some of the lighting controls. We'll touch on that shortly. But lighting is purely functional within this space. The multi-tenanted lease space varies because it's populated over time. So it's not populated in one go as the building is signed off and built. It will sort of slowly be populated within that space as the clients take on the space. And therefore, as a result, the space tends to be lit a little bit more aesthetically because you'll have clients coming into the space to view the data centre.
It's a marketing element.
Exactly, absolutely. So a bit more of an aesthetic appeal for the multi-tenanted lease spaces. So you might see more of a sort of like a lines of light, a little bit more of an aesthetic touch to the lighting there. But the construction of the fabric of the building isn't phased. It has to be built in one go. But on this basis, there's also means that there's a sort of preference for localised emergency lighting.
Okay, emergency being a very big aspect of data centres.
Exactly, and that then leads us on to the sort of the central battery aspect. So central battery emergency lighting is fairly prevalent within data centres. This tends to be used for the multi-tenanted lease spaces because they are constructed in one go, and therefore the batteries and the battery system, the lighting linked to it, is all sort of built in one go and installed in one go. With the owner-operators, they tend to have that phased construction, so it's very difficult to construct and build a central battery-operated lighting system when the system is phased. So, like the retail element and also the logistics big sheds, E-Line is very well suited to this, and E-Line Next system also allows for integrated and approved central battery integration within the lighting system, and it can also fully integrate sensors and functionality, but also consequently, if you're not utilising a central battery backup system, it can also operate a localised emergency system.
Emergency.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm intrigued. Tell me about the hot aisle, cold aisle principle.
So this is one of the key elements to designing data centres, is they utilise this principle of hot aisles and cold aisles. So servers will be positioned in their racks back to back. You will have cold air coming in through the front of the server racks, going through the servers into a hot aisle that is in between the two servers on the back side. So the cold side will be generally where the humans occupy the space, so the engineers, etc. And then the hot aisle, that air will then be exhausted out and into the infrastructure to then be cooled around again. So it's the server exhausts face each other, and they provide airflow management and efficient cooling method, but they keep the comfort on the service side for the engineers.
Yeah.
So temperature ranges, you'll generally see sort of 50 degrees in the hot aisle and 25 degrees in the cold aisle.
So both quite hot.
Both quite warm, but it's the 50 degree side of it that can often sort of provide a challenge for lighting to ensure that you have a luminaire that can operate at a 50 degree ambient temperature, which is, as you say, quite a high temperature range.
Yes, I mean LEDs actually prefer it cold.
They would. So they're going to love the cool side of the aisle, but not necessarily the warm side of the aisle. So one of the other key design principles for data centres, other than the hot aisle and the cold aisle, is also the ceiling type. And obviously with the cold air coming in, generally that will come through the floor, and then the hot air will come out through the ceiling. We'll have a lot of ventilation ducts within the ceiling space. So depending upon the ceiling type will depend on the sort of type of lighting used. Now, data centres generally marry up very, very well to a linear format lighting.
Linear racks.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And therefore also, good vertical illumination for the engineers, good horizontal illumination for if you've got a tenant space and you need to show the space off as well. But some data centres will utilise a 600 by 600 ceiling grid. Now the disadvantage to this is that the 600 grid doesn't necessarily line up every time with where the data centre racks are positioned, and they're also limited by the venting within the space or the fire detection system as well, which is very key to a data centre. So whilst you will see 600 by 600 layouts, they generally are not very well optimised at the space, and it's better to go down the linear route if at all possible.
And a suspended ceiling is probably not necessary in a data centre. You
will find the suspended part generally on the hot aisle, because obviously that's being exhausted and then that will be going down pipes. But as you can see from one of these images, they've got an open soffit ceiling. So again, as you say, it is not contained and got a suspended ceiling in place. But it varies from site to site and job to job, and also from client to client. Certain clients on the owner-occupier have a very fixed method by which they wish to operate. Okay. So it's sort of copy and paste from data to data centre.
Yeah. So generally, there aren't many people in data centres?
None, ideally.
Yeah. We might have a control room where somebody has to react if there's an emergency. We have to make sure they have the correct lighting, that this will respond in an emergency. But if we've got people there, we've got to consider their needs.
Yes.
We might have to employ lighting that would be used within an office environment.
Absolutely.
And meet all of those requirements.
Yeah, and maybe even HCL, because some of these control rooms might be windowless as well.
Yes, and 24-hour manning.
Yeah. So there are tiers of data centres as well, so very strict criteria. Tier 2 from a lighting perspective requires very basic elements from a lighting controls perspective. All it requires is sort of a occupancy sensing and just triggering on of the luminaires. So it doesn't give any more criteria than that.
Okay.
But if you then sort of go on to tier 3 and tier 4 data centres, there are some more strict, stringent requirements for lighting and how the space is lit. So generally it requires usage of CCTV cameras, so you need to have certain levels for the CCTV equipment, which this day and age is not difficult to achieve. But you also have to have entry motion sensors that activate the lights in the immediate area, so it's more based around the sort of area where an engineer may be rather than turning all the lights on in the complete data centre.
So running light type principle.
Exactly. And they also need to be able to be programmed to illuminate aisles and passageways, because you'll have one going one way and one going the other way.
So what determines what the tier level is for a data centre?
That's a little bit more complex, but that's more to do with the level of security that the data centre is providing. So the data centre will be designed to a particular tier, and then that will then impact us on the lighting aspect and what the minimum criteria are. But the criteria on tier 2 is relatively low. Tier 3, a little bit more complex, but nothing too difficult. In terms of lighting levels, you talk about 500 lux on the horizontal, 200 lux on the vertical at a metre high, and these are to the aisles where the area is worked on only. So going back to the hot aisle, cold aisle, generally in the cold aisle only. But as I said earlier, ideally no people.
Yeah.
It's slightly different when you come to a multi-tenanted lease space, because you may have an engineer coming in there to work on just the TRILUX server. And that then opens up security aspects of an engineer coming into a space that's got multiple companies operating within that space who could go and access their server networks, and making sure that they are only limited to working within the space of the TRILUX server.
So you've probably got quite a few security cameras.
Absolutely, but not just that, but you could also link the lighting to that security aspect as well, as to where is that person operating, how are they operating.
Which can give you more feedback data.
Exactly.
And then we can go to the other extreme, the lights out data centres.
Yes, but this doesn't mean that there's no lighting.
No.
It just means the lights are out.
Switched off.
Yeah. So here, there are no staff, so therefore there is no light requirement. So why have lighting even on at maybe 5 or 10% if there are no staff in there? So it is not lit at all. Whilst there are a lot of data centres that have a specification that say lights out data centre, the reality is slightly different. So whilst the devices are accessed and managed remotely, so minimising the staff, maybe only 1 or 2 staff on site, it does offer some energy savings on the lighting. But in reality, the energy savings offered by the lighting in comparison to the server power that's being used
must be minuscule.
is minuscule. It does reduce the staffing costs, and it can mean that they can locate the site further from populated areas, which reduces the threat of malicious attacks, which is one of the aspects on the security side of the higher end of data centres. But going back to the reality of it, the reality is that whilst many data centres operate, that they believe that they have a lights out operation and facility, in practice they don't. So all the lights are turned on manually when an engineer enters a small zone. So he might be only entering a small space, but they'll turn all the lights on at 100%.
Okay, really?
So the reality is how much energy are they saving by doing the lights out, and actually a lot of the time they're leaving the lights on because it is this manual switch process. So lights out data centres, they exist, but actually the feedback is that they don't actually operate on a lights out basis all the time.
Okay.
So one of the other interesting developments for data centres is Power over Ethernet, or PoE.
It's ideal, really.
So the reason for it being ideal is obviously the one key point is that the data centre, when it's built, the majority of it is done using network cabling and IT professionals. So here, if you've got lighting that is network based, then you could utilise the same contractors who are doing the IT infrastructure for doing the lighting. So therefore, from a security aspect, it means that the IT comms team also service the lights. So it keeps the security aspect down, and you're not relying on electrical contractors servicing the lights. You can be using IT companies and professionals servicing the lights. There are also other key aspects to this, and this is more to do with the security operational aspects of the building, in that with an engineer, especially if you've got multi-tenanted lease space, you can utilise the PoE technology of lighting as a wayfinding via Bluetooth beacons within the space to take you to the exact server location that they might be working on. But it could also be used to program alert mechanisms, so whether they be remote or local, and also create environmental reports that are customised to a particular client within the multi-tenanted lease spaces. So you can have data that's captured by the PoE lighting that could then feed back as automated reports back to individual clients, to their sort of whims and wishes that they might have for that particular environment.
Do you think data centres are pushing the boundaries and this kind of technology might then be incorporated into other buildings?
I think it's interesting on the PoE side, but the PoE side for data centres it makes sense. Yeah. You can see the aspect of that. Whereas with regards to sort of logistics and retail, there's not as much reliance on the IT infrastructure construction part of the process. So I think maybe data centres is more at the sort of leading edge, bleeding edge of it, and then maybe the uptake of PoE into retail and logistics might come on board for the controlling and reporting aspects of it and the infrastructure. But I think there's a big void between the two.
But one thing is certain, data centres are going to be with us for a long time, and that market is definitely growing. It's going to be very interesting to see how it moves forward into the future.
Indeed.
So thank you very much for listening to us, and we hope to see you again on the next TRILUX Academy video.
Thank you very much. From myself, Jamie Yates, goodbye.
And from me, goodbye.